In this section, we're going to discuss calling or invoking methods. A method is a named piece of code that has to be invoked or called in order to execute. So far, we've just written lines of code that were executed. Method calls are names that we type in with our code, and the control flow will jump to that method and begin execution. And upon finishing that chunk of code, returns to where the invocation or call was made from and continues from there. A method usually returns a value of some type. We've done the example before of a square root. We expect that to return a value, which is the square root of the number we tell it that we want. The method definition itself determines what that type will be, and code in the method body determines what the value will be. It is an expression. The type is defined and the value is computed. The code conceptually is simply replaced by the value. In the example below, we see two different values, initialization by literal or init by literal, and I assign that to 1.77, and then init by expression, math.square root of 3.14159. Turns out that init by literal and init by expression will have roughly the same value. I say roughly because with floating point numbers, we only ever get approximations, not absolutes in most cases. So to compare two floating point numbers, use the technique shown in the bottom line of code. Take the absolute value of the difference of the two values, make sure that is less than some tiny number, and often something in the range of 1 exponent of negative 12. If it's less than that, then they're close enough to be considered equal. A method that defines parameters needs to be designed and coded in such a way that it properly computes the result regardless of what numbers we pass in. The method is an algorithm. It answers the question of how do I compute the value? We do not give it actual values to compute when we're writing the method body. We say, given any value that matches this parameter, how do I go about computing it? If a value is invalid, we either need to reject it or throw an exception saying that that value cannot be used. Otherwise, the algorithm needs to handle the value. The calling or invoking method passes values to the invoked method. These values are called arguments. The invoking code determines specific values and passes them to the method it is invoking. We had the example of math.square root of 3.14159. The 3.14159 is the argument. It is a specific value. The square root method says, given any floating point number, what is the square root of it if it's a legitimate value? Obviously, we can't take square roots of negative numbers, so it would reject those values. Here's a key. The argument value is copied into the method's parameters. That is how those parameter variables are initialized. They are copied. And once copied, there now exists two copies of that value. One in the argument literal or variable, and one in the parameter variable. Two separate copies. They are not the same, and if you affect one, the other is unaffected. A good way to remember argument versus parameter is the word camp. Caller has arguments, CA, method has parameters, MP.